Hello everybody, I'm Raphael Perry and it's time for a little more Bloodsword. Now I did promise a final thoughts at the end of the book for book 2, just as I did at the end of book 1. So here we are. This adventure had a lot of tough fights. And actually, because the storyline was more linear and less focused on the dungeon, it was a better story. But it did draw more attention to the fights because there was less distraction between them. That being said, I didn't involve every fight, but I did notice a lot of enemies seem to have a fighting prowess of 8 and deal 2d6 damage. And with our party members having between 15 and 18 endurance points and a 2 or 3 armor rating, that 2d6 damage would, it should have averaged about 4 or 5 points maybe every time they hit. But it had the potential to spike quite significantly. I got very lucky fighting the skeletal stalker. In the werewolf fight, it was obvious that I had to try and kill one werewolf quickly, keep the other one busy, and the servants were there to contribute a minor threat to enhance the threat level of the werewolves, and the werewolves were the main problem. When it came to the skeletal stalker, I attempted to exercise it, and I failed, but that significantly weakened it so that it was only doing 2d6 damage instead of 3d6. There were a lot of enemies in this adventure that we didn't necessarily fight who would be doing 3 or 4 dice of damage. So this adventure featured a lot of enemies who could hit us really, really hard. This essentially means that we had a lot of opportunities to lose party members, and the chances of making it through with a full party at the end were slim. Now, we did play carefully and cleverly and abuse the defend option because, hey, we really, really needed to. But if we'd been a bit more reckless, we would have been taking heavy damage and would have hopefully learned to protect ourselves better. A lot of those fights with hard-hitting enemies were avoidable fights, optional fights. Some were punishments for doing things wrong. And things we didn't necessarily get to learn. Griston, the guardian beast, that stands outside the palace, he regenerates. If you take him down, he just gets back up and his health comes back, and you can keep fighting him again and again and again until you give up and run into the castle. Actually, no, I think it's just like he gets back up and it's obvious you don't want to fight him again. The Ice Lacken is a tough fight, and the dice really didn't like me when I tried it. These suits of armour in the Lady Grey encounter, they can hit quite hard. You'll notice that Sir Alwyn isn't here with the rest of the heroes. There's a reason for that, because I'm going to do a rematch on I'm going to do a fight that I didn't actually do in a little moment. The story in this adventure is broken down into roughly a number of sections. You've got the bit with the werewolves, which essentially, then you got the bit with the werewolves, then you got the skeletal stalker, and then you've got arriving at the coast after going through a few towns with not a lot happening, where you can help the old knight defeat the lady in grey and get the special orbs that relate to the 5 true ancient archmagi. Then you've got the voyage. Now, there's 3 ways you can go on that voyage. I chose one option, The second option is the evil wizard on the magic carpet who came and intercepted us. The third option is to go on a whaling ship. And the captain is insane. He wants to go and hunt Jormungand. Yes, Jormungand from Norse mythology. The thing about the world of legend is it's recognisable, but ever so slightly different, so that it does feel like a different world. He basically wants to play Moby Dick with the world serpent. However, he's going on a different route to the merchant ship where we would have had to row, and so the wizard on the flying carpet doesn't find him. But you're going to get shipwrecked, or what do you call it? There'll be a mutiny and you'll be cast overboard with the captain in a little boat, something like that. It always ends up at the same town. And after that, you've got the ice lacken on the lake. And you have a walk across the ice to the ice lacken, which is a tough fight if you didn't bring the orb of fire. But it's obviously supposed to be doable, because you have options to use the orb of fire later on, or the orb of disease, or possibly even, if you didn't take the orb of fire, the orb of death basically nukes an encounter. It's like everyone makes a psychic ability or dies, but everyone who isn't the character who used it has a much higher survival chance. They're like rolling a d6 instead of 2d6, or like d6 plus 3 or something, The orb of gift gives you a random gift. The orb of disease gives you a random disease, but if you carry it around, it protects you. The orb of disease can give you a random disease, permanently mess with your stats, or make you permanently immune to diseases. Or we could just have carried it and had protection from disease there as it sucks it in. Now, I chose the route of carnage into the castle. I didn't choose either of the other two gates. Those two paths, the path of confusion and the path of... what's the other one? The path of fear. They converge essentially in the Great Hall before the Cathedral of Death, with the dead dancers and the cobwebs. Which means we would not have gained the Axe of Heraclos if we had taken either of the other two paths. Speaking of which, when confronting the Warlock King, it is possible to engage him in combat at the end. He's not necessarily the greatest combatant, depending on which items you've used. But if you don't have the standard of the first Selentine Legion of Silentium, you're just killed by all the skeletons. The other warriors do not come to your aid. You need to summon the first Selentine Legion first, which means you need to run through the Gauntlet of Death in the Cathedral of Death and face Thanatos the Giant, who guards the standard. And we had an option to accept his challenge of single combat. Now, if we enter into single combat with Thanatos the Giant, and I'm blatantly going to do that here. I did go back, check the video, and Sir Alwyn was on full endurance points at the start of that fight. So I don't need to pre-damage him. I've reset his stats down to rank 3, and I've given him some different equipment. He still bears the Axe of Heraclos, but because he's fighting against a giant, he wields Blutgetranker, the giant-slaying sword. So, and I've just increased his raw stats to the totals instead of adding all the modifiers, because this is a one-off rematch, and I'll just reload, If he had the... where are we? So this is a lovely PDF from the authors which summarises all the combat sections from every book in the series. Now, note, The Skull Amulet, if you have it, gives some protection against Thanatos, who derives his power from the god of the unliving, Chernoborg. If you're wearing this amulet, add 7 to your armor rating and damage scores for the duration of this fight only. So I have given him the Skull Amulet, and I've given him the Sage's Shielding Charm for +1 armor. So with his mail, and the 7 for 3 points, and the 7 points from the Skull Amulet, and the 1 point for the Shielding Charm, he's going into this fight with an armor rating of 11. He's also fighting with a fighting prowess of 10. That's 8 plus 1 for Fearless, plus 1 for Blutgetranker. And as Blutgetranker ups his damage from 1d6 plus 2 to 2d6 plus 2 against giants, and he gets another 7 points from the Skull Amulet, he is dealing 2d6 plus 9 points of damage here. With his awareness of 6, it means Thanatos is going to go first. So I'm just going to run for his fight now, because I feel like it. So, single combat, there's no point defending. Everyone else just gets to watch. It's just slugging it out there, taking turns to hit each other. So, Thanatos will attack first. And hits for 4d6 damage. Now, he rolls 12. That is 1 whole point to Sir Alwyn the Warrior, who then returns the favour. That is a hit for 2d6 plus 9 damage. At 17, Thanatos only has an armor rating of 2, so he takes 15 damage, straight down to 30. Now, unless Thanatos rolls exceedingly high for damage, he can't do more than 24, so 13. Okay, he can still hit reasonably hard. Let's see how he does for an attack. Oh, and I should have obviously moved initiative on. Round 2, Thanatos attacks. And hits for 15. Okay, 4 damage. So he has been rolling incredibly high for damage. I don't think he got like single figures once, even though it's very possible with 4 dice. Sir Alwyn will strike back with his giant slaying sword. That's a hit. So 2d6 plus 9, that's basically 7 points before anything. 13 damage takes us down to 17 here. Round 3, Thanatos attacks. At this point, it's starting to look a bit predetermined, although not necessarily every player would have realised that the Skull Amulet would be useful here. We had been told the Skull Amulet would be useful in this area, so we might have thought, okay, we haven't had an opportunity to use it yet. So perhaps 11, bang on the armour, bounces off. So perhaps we should use it, and not everyone necessarily think of giving him the Shielding Charm as well at the same time. Hits for 17. Takes Thanatos down to 2 endurance points. So this would have saved Remy a lot of pain and hardship. Thanatos attacks. Probably hits. Yep. For 4 dice. 16. Okay, 5 damage. You know what? This is starting to look like some serious harm. However, this may be an end on it. Oh, yes. Yeah, 18 damage. Thanatos, the giant, is defeated once again. But it was nice to see. Obviously, I've got like a separate file of the characters all set up, ready to go into book 3. Unsnap from grid. So let's talk a little about theme. There is something which stood out to me, which was that the... How do I put this best? once we got to the Kingdom of Wyrd, we'd already played almost over half the adventure. It felt as if the journey from that forest clearing to the ocean, over the sea, and into the Forest of Wyrd itself was so long, it took up a large portion of the adventure. And once we arrived, there wasn't much left to do. It was just a matter of not necessarily going through the motions, but a relatively short experience, from the ice lacken through the village, through the woods, into the castle. Short castle, because really it's 3 little bits of the castle that then join up, so the content is it divides the length. And then the Cathedral of Death and the Warlock King, and that's it. Ending rather abruptly. Now that's okay, because in terms of content length, it did give a good impression of the length of the journey we were undertaking. We were travelling a far way to a distant land. And I think it was okay to have a long journey portion of the adventure that emphasised not necessarily the hardships we were undergoing, but the great distance we were travelling. It did often feel as if the journey to the Kingdom of Wyrd itself was more deadly than our encounters in the kingdom. But that is because we handled ourselves carefully. We tried to reason our way through things, not make rash and foolish mistakes in the Kingdom of Wyrd, because we knew that it was great stakes at this point, and we didn't want to mess up. There are, some very challenging combat encounters in the Kingdom of Wyrd. If we'd fought the Ice Hounds, they don't necessarily... There's a lot of encounters, though. In addition to all of those fighting prowess 8 or 9 with 2d6 damage foes and the assorted 3 and 4d6 foes, there's a lot of fighting prowess 7 and 8 with 1d6 plus 3 combat encounters as well. And I'm not just saying because there's a separate version of the fight with the sylphs on the bridge for every party member. So there are some light damaging encounters where, the writers aren't trying to kill the heroes. They're just trying to make them feel threatened, maybe do a little bit of damage to soften them up for future encounters. If you don't have a sage and you're relying on healing items, which are pretty rare, or the ability to rest in villages and inns, which are also pretty rare, there were a lot of opportunities to recover endurance points in between fights. And in terms of the pacing in between fights, the combats were not too close together, which allowed a good amount of time for a sage to replenish health for everyone. Apart from in the last few sessions where he just kept rolling ones. Oh, that was painful. Yeah. Look, that was luck. I'm going to put it down to luck because I could go for the gambler's fallacy of saying, look, the odds of rolling that many ones in a row are slim, but every roll is a separate roll. And it's only the odds of that one roll that count and matter. Yes, it was statistically incredibly improbable to roll that many ones, although Map Tools does have sticky dice, which like to get stuck on a side and keep rolling that side a few times. I did occasionally take measures to adjust that by doing the old dice resetting trick. Not sure it necessarily helped very much, but hey, it was okay. Yeah. What? Oh, the other pattern I noticed was, as in the first book, there is a challenging final encounter which can be avoided through the use of items. So, book 1, we had collect the body parts of the giant and bring them to the end of the dungeon and reconstruct the giant, who you may then fight. And we used an item to bypass that fight through cunning and wit. And again in this encounter, We had a lot of portions to our forces, and were able to absolutely trounce the Warlock King's skeleton army. If our force had been smaller, we would have had to fight some of the skeletons ourselves, and there would have been a number of encounters based on the size of our force, and I think possibly also a random dice roll for a bit of luck to come into it. If we'd had a sort of mid-sized force, there would be like 3 different ways the encounter could go. And so there were a number of encounters fighting skeletons, and the amount of skeletons we would fight would be dependent on the amount that the rest of our force was taking care of. You know, some could break through our ranks, we'd have different formations and stuff. It would depend on what was available to us. And then we had the final encounter with the Warlock King himself, where we were still able to use the Iron Bell. I don't know what would happen if we used a gold ring, but if we used the silver wolf head's brooch clasp, he would have turned it into a giant silver wolf to attack us. You know, so there are ways he has a lot of control over that scenario, and there's only a few items that really mess him up. And we could have ended up having to fight him at the end. We were in no fit state to do so, and we once again bypassed a potentially deadly encounter through the clever use of a magical item. I don't think that's quite as possible in the 3rd book, where the pattern doesn't quite repeat itself that way. That being said, book 1 also breaks down into portions, areas, right? You've got the part in town before the dungeon. You got the first portion of the dungeon, which, if you work for one of the warlocks, Balhazar, is meeting the elf maiden, getting gifts, rewards, going on and meeting the barbarians. If you work for the Callaghan, it's going through a cave complex, rowing across a lake, and then meeting the barbarians and arriving in that place. But basically it's the portion in town before the barbarians, the gambler, all as one section, like the first level of the dungeon. Teleport down to the bottom level, you've got the everything up to the temple of Echidna, which you may or may not enter. Then the rest of that portion, depending how well you've done there, you may bypass some of it with teleporting or not. You meet Icon the Ungodly, potentially something like 4 sections after fighting Echidna, which is brutal. And his spells are really nasty. And then you've got the path to, you know, building the giant, collecting all the body parts, and the way out and victory. So again, there's sections of the adventure where you can explore and move around quite a bit in those sections before moving on. You can take wrong turnings, fall into traps and stuff. Bad things happen. Just like here, we had the werewolves, the fleeing from the skeletal stalker, helping optionally, but blatantly well worth it, helping the old knights of Varadaxor, crossing the ocean, and then the section in the Kingdom of Wyrd. The section of the Kingdom Wyrd is best divided into before the castle and then in the castle. But essentially, there's a good story structure to each of them. The second book, the focus of the story and the structure of the adventure is the feeling of progress towards a goal. Whereas in the dungeon, it's this level of the dungeon, this bit of the dungeon in the first book. If the portions of the dungeon in the first book feel random and disjointed, you know that your end goal is the emblem of victory. Or the banner of victory, I can't remember. And in the second book, you know your end goal is to get to the Kingdom of Wyrd and get the hilt of the blood sword so you can combine it with the scabbard and then go looking for the blade before the 5 elder magi bring in the apocalypse and destroy the world. Oh yeah, speaking of which, as a nice little bonus, because we never lost the scabbard, let's go and look at section 419. and see what would have happened if we had lost it. Oh, it's a long one. You float in a timeless void. Eternal space surrounds you, a thing without depth, colour, or form. There is no sound. How long have you been here? Time means nothing in the stark void, but your last mortal memories were of relinquishing the jewelled blood-sword scabbard. The giant image of the scabbard floats against the darkness before you. Taunting laughter echoes all around you, gradually filling the emptiness with the sense of time and staggering space. The image of the lost scabbard disappears. 5 majestic lords appear, huge and mighty. Their presence overwhelms your senses. They radiate light. Each is robed in a single colour, shining with so agonizing and absolute of that colour that your vision stings and swims. On one side you behold a lord in scarlet, on another a lord in cerulean blue, a third is clad in emerald green, another in gold, and the last of the dreadlords is wrapped in scintillating white. Scintillant white? That sounds wrong. The Red Lord speaks. In the place where mortal voices, foes of strong lords, spoke to the shapers of men's fate, that place was called in mortal tongue Spite. The walls of Spite towered high, continues the Blue Lord, for it was not yet at the time that feuds should crack the keystones, nor at that time had ravening flame tasted the ramparts. This long endured, says the Lord in green. Those who cannot speak of the first days of Middle-earth spoke their lore to mortal ear. Mortal words, though those of lords most wise, were counted by all from shore to shore, as inviolate commands. It is the turn of the gold. The brutish thing that lives in the darkness of the belly then stirred, the cursed creature that drives oath brother to war with oath brother, that hellish hate that eats from within. From threescore, now only 5 await the day that is to come, announces the White. The images grow dim. From this pernicious place we shall go, escape the foul fastness of the void, and return into the mortal land. No thing on Middle-earth now opposes us. The 5 lords fade away, and you are left alone in the void. Dun 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 dun. I seem to recall that the section in Book 3 for losing the hilt and the scabbard of the bloodsword is similar to this, but the 5 lords do not speak of the history of the city of Spite and the coming of hate. Instead, they prophesy what is to come in rather ominous, scary pseudo-astrological and astronomical talk. They talk about conjunctions, stars meeting, the time being right, preparing their plans, and hint at what is to come, if they succeed. And the fact that now nothing opposes them and they shall succeed. So when they're prophesying what is to come, they're literally saying what they are going to do. And that it is now inevitable. It had a very strong sense of doom, that section, and I will try to avoid it when I play Book 3. Alright, there we go. There's some thoughts on the first 2 books. Hope you enjoyed that. A lot of the bonus items from this book that we gained won't translate well into the next book, so the characters are going to be ditching their bedding and thick cloaks and gloves because they're not going to need them in the warm desert lands of, what is it now? It's, Come on, it's a medieval Crusader kingdom with weird French-sounding name that should probably... It looks like it should sound better the other way. I'm going to just blatantly, you know, open book free because it's completely Outre-mer, which sounds like it should be Outremer. Outremer sounds like a strong place, like Outremer. And also because it's the kingdom of the Outlanders who come from across the sea in their little boats up here on the corner of the map. But no, it's Outre-mer, apparently. Yeah, I looked it up. I know. Looked it up when I was a teenager, when I was interested in these sort of things. As I still am to this day. Things like the Iron Bell. It was good against magic, but I think it's mostly good against the fairy magic of the Kingdom of Wyrd. The same goes for a lot of other items. I don't think the skull amulet will be of use again. The amber tinderbox probably isn't going to be useful in book 3 or later on. So, Screeb over Raven, who we picked up, is useful in book 2. There's a point, I think, on the way to the Kingdom of Wyrd where we can be lost and he can show us the way or something. We didn't run into that encounter, but that's okay. It really is fine. I can't for the life of me remember what it was or where it was, but I do know that he was useful and wasn't a waste of money. I don't think he's going to be useful again in the rest of the series, but we have a pet raven now. What fun. Okay, so that about wraps it up for book 2. I'm going to take a few days off, maybe even as much as a week, before I start book 3, but I'll put something else up on the channel in the meantime. I hope you've all enjoyed this episode, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in the very next one, where we will begin book 3, The Demon's Claw. Goodbye for now, everyone. You're all heroes for making it this far. Even me, I am a hero too. Allegedly. Bye-bye.